Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, the General Counsel for ChainArgos. With me, as usual, every week, Jonathan Reiter, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscribes. Appreciate it. So this week, what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about the StarkNet ETH-BTC Bridge. That's one thing we're going to talk about. The GENIUS Stablecoin Act, as it's sort of meandering its way through Congress. And then finally, more updates on... Well, it's not really updates. We're just going to go through some of the ByBit hack flows and have a look at that. You know, we've been covering ByBit for a bit now on the show, and we're just going to go into a little bit more detail as to what that looks like on the chart. So, well, let's just jump straight into the StarkNet ETH-BTC Bridge. John, you want to tell us about that?
So StarkNet, which is a L2 scaling solution with a somewhat unique setup, claimed that they were going to release some Bitcoin-related scaling solution that would scale Bitcoin and then would allow unifying Bitcoin and Ethereum. I found that kind of interesting. So the first thing to note is that StarkNet's been running a somewhat unique scaling L2 setup on Ethereum for quite a while using the Starkware, whatever, stack. And the thing still has a number of centralized components that they're still talking about how to get rid of. At a high level, it's a little bit similar to the way, Arbitrum is much more complicated than Optimism, and so Arbitrum exists as like a single thing. Optimism has many, many copies. Starkware is also complicated, so there's really just one. People aren't copying it and doing it themselves. Right, wrong, whatever. The complexity isn't necessarily valuable. So that means there's fewer people looking at it, maybe, and that it's quite centralized. So they're not, as they haven't solved that problem yet, what they're proposing doing is running a trusted bridge. I say trusted bridge. They're still listed as a stage 0 and L2B and whatnot. So there's a consensus that this is a trust. If you run a trusted L2 type bridge connection on Bitcoin and on Ethereum, and then you can connect both of them at the same time, you've just run a trusted bridge between Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is fine.
But let's not pretend there's any kind of innovation.
Yeah. We're going to scale Bitcoin by providing a trusted thing that, now maybe their scheme will work. The oldest scaling solution in the entire thing is Lightning on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Or at least the oldest, still extant, whatever, still kicking scaling solution, which never really took off, presumably because of the trust compromises it required.
Yeah.
Right, the Bitcoin community. Whatever you say about some people not caring about decentralization, some reasonable fraction of the Bitcoin community very clearly do actually care about that. And that stuff's just not of interest. Fine. So I don't know. The Ethereum side it won't be a problem, should attract interest. Of course, they're already operating there, so there's nothing new, right? Maybe they will be an interesting alternative bridge between the two of them, right? At the moment, you end up having, wrapped Bitcoin, and that's not particularly programmable, but at least it's large and I'll say trusted, both in the sense that you have to trust the custodian and that people seem to trust the custodian. So maybe the Starkware thing has more math, even though there's still an element of trust, and that will be interesting to see where that develops. Some of this overlaps with this OP-CAT instruction from a long time ago that opens up interesting attack surfaces in Bitcoin. So the Starkware people seem convinced, I guess, they can get that through or they can push for it. Maybe we can cover the technical details of OP-CAT and Bitcoin scaling and stuff that was doable in Bitcoin in 2009, early 10, and then got stopped for some reason, and whether or not that should actually come back. There's a lot of attack surface associated with the software that they require to do what they're doing. But we talked about a couple times how Bitcoin is programmable, but and making it a little bit bigger increases the attack surface, and a lot of people don't want that because, as we just said, they care very much about simple, secure, decentralized, whatever product, and Starkware will require some compromise to get there, whether it's worth it or not. People are interested in Ethereum's side, interesting scaling trust compromises, Bitcoin not so much.
Yeah.
One imagines that the eventual reception will be the same as the reception to every other attempt at scaling Bitcoin through a trust compromise, which is that it turns out the users don't want it. But, maybe they'll solve all their centralization issues, and then maybe that'll be acceptable to people. They have to do that first. They could demonstrate that on Ethereum. So it's not like they have to go to the Bitcoin people and try to convince them. They can just say, we're going to demonstrate it in production over here in an industry, in a slice that doesn't care so much.
Yeah.
If you upgraded to fully trustless, decentralized, Ethereum people wouldn't run away. They would just, oh, okay, great. We don't care anymore. It's not better or worse. And then you'd be able to do this. So I find the strategy interesting, given that their recently published 2025 roadmap to decentralization doesn't state job done. It states something else that's getting there but not achieving the goal. Maybe they should fix that before the other thing. That's a marketing and product development suggestion more than anything else.
Well, okay. Moving on.
That makes sense, right?
No, I know.
The two communities have very different feelings about this.
The two communities not only have different feelings, they have very different visions and goals and ideologies.
And empirical usage data.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trusted solutions get used in Ethereum all the time. Bitcoin, they just don't.
It's almost like you're assuming that this is what they want. Honestly, if this is what they wanted, they would have done it a long time ago.
Yeah, trusted Bitcoin scaling is not hard.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't need OP-CAT. You have to simplify the way some stuff works, but it's not. You could achieve trusted scale. Well, anyway, yeah. Okay.
I mean, what I feel is that in this case, they're trying to. It's a feature, not a bug. In this case, and they're trying to introduce a bug, and in the guise of a feature.
It feels like until they resolve beyond the expectations on the Ethereum side that it is introducing a bug on Bitcoin.
Yeah, it is. Essentially, I mean, if I was a Bitcoin maximalist, I would see this as a bug. So, GENIUS Stablecoin Act, John?
So this is the latest attempt at stablecoin regulation in the U.S. It's quite different than the Stable Act. I like the Stable Act is a clever name.
About that act.
GENIUS Act is a. So I think the key difference here is that there's a different split between state and federal regulation, whatever. The key difference is that all of these stablecoin providers are going to be treated as financial institutions for compliance purposes, Bank Secrecy Act and all of the other things. And there are explicit mandates to have freezing, sanctions compliance programs, all the rest of it. So what that means is you have somebody regulated, whoever the regulator is, there's a whole structure for based on the size, and you can opt into state and federal, whatever. You're something that's regulated as a financial institution by, in some cases, a bank regulator under the Bank Secrecy Act and similar stuff, is going to have to make decisions about compliance around bearer instruments that they've issued, and there's no question that they're going to have obligations around high-value transfers of those bearer instruments. So people will say, yeah, but cash is a bearer instrument, and it is, and banks don't ask questions if you deposit $56 in cash. If you deposit $56 in cash every hour for but if it's just sort of random incidental use, nobody cares. So they are definitely going to be within the standard bank compliance perimeter. This act would place these things in the standard bank compliance perimeter for those types of activities. Already there's complaining that this is effectively a CBDC type arrangement where surveillance is required. It's not proposing a government issued product, but it is absolutely proposing standard bank compliance for permissionless transfers. How those things will interact remains to be seen. I guess there will be interesting discussions around how this act would work, but it's going to force people to say clearly that they don't want permissionless transfers of arbitrary size subjected to the high-value transfer surveillance requirements of standard bank compliance in the United States. And that is the position of many of these folks. So we'll see how that goes. You can see that both ways, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it's a bit on the nose. So that's interesting. That's the key difference, that it cuts through a lot of things by not creating so much new regulatory infrastructure and too many laws. It just creates a classification for who you go to for your licenses, and you follow the existing rules. Some subsets apply to different people, but in fact, they don't change the rules that much. They change the enforcer. But all the large stablecoins will end up effectively under either state, which would turn out to be New York State, or federal, which is where they are anyway.
Yeah. So...
vaguely related to that, because it's also in the banking space, there was a little bit of an OCP, a little bit of a choke point update, which talks about stablecoins, a little bit subtext, but this is a Chicago Fed piece that came out that dissects very clearly, very detailed what happened as far as the couple of banks that failed 2023, and makes clear that this was pretty much entirely due to a small number of, they even call out, venture capital firm and fintech investor type withdrawals from banks, and that even Silvergate, which isn't listed on the failed list, effectively failed. I think the phrase they use is something like, by any sensible definition, they failed. They just voluntarily unwound, so the FDIC doesn't.
They didn't fail because somebody told them to fail. They failed because they chose to fail.
It is the old Warren Buffett quote about bank bank solvency regulation being a self-assessment where the penalty for failure is death. Right? If you assess yourself as insolvent, they shut you down. And it's the first bank I can remember that assessed itself as insolvent and shut itself down. So there you go. So it's interesting that's. I don't think that they're going to delve any harder on that. It's totally non-political. These are just researchers at the Chicago Fed looking at bank data, which is their job, the Chicago Fed. Whether that's going to make any difference in the way people talk about these things is unclear.
It's interesting times. Finally, let's run through some data.
Okay.
The ByBit hack close, John.
So, all right. So we've talked about ByBit stuff a little bit already. So now there are a number of sources. You can do this yourself. You can download whatever for where the stolen money went. And this is just the simple process of, everyone can find. You can Google. You can find the transaction hashes for the large transfers out of the cold wallet. And from there, and the question is just tracing where the stuff went. So just to keep this simple for visual, we're going to look at transactions just on Ethereum. So these are just the Ethereum addresses because we can watch the escape. So we've got a list here. I don't remember when this was last updated, but it's, thousands, whatever, of addresses that have been identified by a number of different service providers, our analysis, various analysis, as being related to the hack. So this is every token, every non-whatever scam, every token in the system here, and the number of active addresses per day. You can see the hack occurred on this column is not wide enough. The hack occurred right here, so you can see an explosion in dates. So there's a lot of ETH. ETH is what was stolen. There's some DAI, USDC, a little bit of USDT, not much else. All right, and this is in volumes in amount of token. So again, just assume that's the first day. We didn't format this very nicely. So you can see in numbers of tokens, again, that we can ignore a lot of these. So from now on, we're just going to ignore the others. The point here is just to show that there is a fair amount of activity all over the place. Okay. There you go. So these are active addresses by day. Now, you can see, a fanning out and then a decrease. We'll come to amounts momentarily. Different tokens were used at different times. The unfreezable DAI was used a lot more than USDC, USDT. Empirical evidence that cyber criminals prefer unfreezable stablecoins. That's pretty compelling, right? There's 10 times as many of these as there are these. A couple days, but slightly busier, whatever. So I don't know that you can say much about ETH being unfreezable relative to the stablecoins that are, because they stole ETH. So you'd expect there to be more usage of the thing that you stole in the first place.
Yeah.
If somebody stole a bunch of DAI, then it would be interesting to see if they switch it to ETH, whatever. So maybe we'll have that happen just for an experiment in the future. This is in dollar terms. So you can see that this is in token terms, and then this is in dollar terms. So you can see in dollar terms, it's all dominated by, this is the theft itself, and then various laundering flows of these addresses. You can see it's actually token amounts of USDC, USDT. They are meaningful amounts of DAI, maybe. This doesn't look like it was the major route to take money out, but fair enough. And the first thing to note here, of course, is what you're watching, in particular in number of addresses, is the race to find where the money's gone. That's somewhat automated. This is just math in graphs. It's not particularly hard. And then you have to contact the owner of the node to seize it, to freeze it, to shut it down. Right? And you have to know who they are, right? So it's an anonymous, maybe you don't know who owns the address. Maybe you know the exchange. Maybe you don't. In some cases, it's an exchange, but you don't know which exchange. We've talked about that before. There's characteristics of exchange addresses. So you're going to lose the race, presumably. And this shows how hard the race is. And remember, we're not saying finding 2,000 nodes in a graph is hard for a computer. That's clearly not the case. Everybody that's gotten driving directions off Google Maps realizes that stuff's pretty quick. But you have to go and then contact all these people and ask them to freeze it because it's not and cannot be reliably automated. That's hard. That's the outrunning that's going on here. So you have to exceed the bandwidth of people to trace down, contact, and stop the flows of funds. And that's going to be hard. We talked previously about Thorchain. So this is inflows to Thorchain of ETH and how it looked like that was pretty close. So now that we're just looking at specific addresses, we can do some interesting analysis. So this is when the hack occurred. So this is the Thorchain deposits, right? So similar setup. The shape looks similar. And in fact, what we've got here is the Thorchain ETH deposits in blue. The specific hacker identified address deposits of ETH into Thorchain, so in red. always going to be less than blue because blue is total. And then these numbers are the gap between them. You can see that the vast majority of the run-up is attributable to these identified addresses. As time passes, you're going to see these red numbers get higher and higher and get closer to being the full blue number. These greens will just disappear because clearly the identified addresses now are a lower bound. I will note that some of the providers have been removing some addresses from some of their lists every so often, I guess, as they make decisions, make mistakes, whatever. But in general, these things always get revised up. We talked about this, the Chainalysis report every year. Everything gets revised up because you only know about the crime you caught, right? Mm-hmm. So that's fine. Nobody's saying that's wrong. But this sort of definitively proves that this is not a coincidence. That the extent to which you believe the red lines correspond to hacker-related addresses, that any of this is correct. The tracing's not hard, so that's quite reliable. That's obviously what happened. It's not hard to see. The natural question then is, could you have caught this somehow? Could better have surveillance done something about it? So what we've got here is just a big listing of the addresses sorted by the date of first transaction. So you see here, some of these addresses did some stuff a while ago. Some of them were dormant, whatever. You can, in fact, look at some of these addresses and you can see what are clearly centralized exchange, small deposits, and test transactions, the rest of it. That's obviously going on. But there's thousands and thousands of addresses here. And all of a sudden, by address number 70 in the list, sorted, whatever, these things were active 2 days before, right? 1 day before. And then there's big gaps, no activity. I don't know how you were going to figure this out. If you go back and look at some of these addresses, actually entertaining, some of them are still active in U.S. regulated freezable stablecoins and haven't been, and are still using the same centralized exchange deposit addresses without any difficulty. So you have to question, if your claim is it could be automated, why is it not being automated? And for the thousands of addresses that were never used before the hack occurred, how were you possibly supposed to stop them? It is not the case that the initial money was fed to these and the new address is only fresh downstream, right? The major hack addresses were all fresh, unused addresses. So this is unrelated laundering mechanics, whatever stuff. So it's pretty clear that the approach that's being taken here is backwards, right? That pushing for stuff not having to be regulated and then asking for voluntary seizures based on tracing efforts is just not going to get there. Right? You at least are going to need to be sure people will comply and that people have sufficient compliance programs that they detect it themselves in advance. The way this works at a bank is the bank is responsible for identifying the bad deposit itself.
Correct.
And gets in trouble for missing it. They're not responsible for responding in a timely fashion to a phone call or email or a telegram message, because why do they have an incentive to do much of anything then? All right. And it's just interesting to watch. You're watching the race, and you can see exactly where it went. I mean, it's not like people couldn't spot this in real time. The graphics are just very nice now in that they make it so obvious exactly what happened, and it's not complicated. Right? I mean, this is not complicated.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I mean, this is a coincidence. This is,
smoking gun.
It's a job done type situation. So that's there you go.
And on that note, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscribes. We appreciate it. Helps us, helps the algorithm, helps us to get this content out there. And we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.